Hello ladies and gentlemen, this is Blue Maxima, and I'm here with another book review today. This is Crackers, The Gold Rush. This is actually relatively niche, especially in comparison to the last two book reviews I did, but I've always been interested in this side of the 80s computer industry. So in the 80s, especially in Europe, there were some examples around the world, but mainly in Europe, there were what they call microcomputers. And a lot of different kinds of computers were fighting for market share, whether it be the Sinclair line with the ZX Spectrum, whether it be Commodore with their Commodore 64 or Commodore Amiga, whether it be Atari with their Atari 800 line or their Atari ST, and a few others like the Amstrads and the BBC Micros and all that. And they all had thriving pirate scenes because these computers were very open with what you could do with them, and the games had to rely entirely on their own copy protection. So people would go to the effort of cracking them, and that's how they became known as crackers. And as a result, this book is determined to talk about them, whether it be their stories, the stories of the industry going on behind them, and how they would interact over the years. And I gotta tell ya, I'm really disappointed in this book. I just don't think it did a good enough job. Now, I'm not gonna claim to be very versed in this area. These guys are probably way more experienced in this area than me, but just the overall way they've done the book itself and the way that they've presented that information has made me just really disappointed in it. I feel like I've come away relatively unsatisfied and not knowing as much as I would have liked to have known about this part of the industry in general. But with that said, let's actually talk about the book and explain why. So, here's the thing. Negative point number one is the delivery. I got this book as part of the first wave of pre-orders, and it took me a little bit longer than that to read it for reasons I'll get into shortly. But they delivered this to me in the first wave of pre-orders, and it came bent. It wasn't packaged very well and suffered a fair bit on the way. And this isn't even as bad as it was. It was like double this. It was really bad. I had to crush it under a heavy amount of books in order to try and flatten it out a bit so I could actually read it. It came in really bad. So as a result, that wasn't great. And I said that it got delivered to me, and technically it wasn't delivered to me. It actually got delivered like 10 houses down the street from me because they got the address wrong. And I don't know how they got the address wrong because I'm pretty damn sure I paid through PayPal. So they would have taken my address from that. And I don't have it wrong on that. So, yeah, that wasn't great. I will at least say, though, that outside of those, the book is actually very well produced. It reminds me a lot of Bitmap Books' efforts. So, I'm just going to bring in an example right here. This is the games that weren't, and they're pretty much the same book in terms of production. So, they've got the same hardback, they've got the same spine, they've got the same page materials, which really helps the art, for example, just jump off the page. It looks really nice, and it's a very nice book to hold. The pages feel great, there's no obvious production errors. It's just it's a well-produced book if it wasn't for the fact that it wasn't bent like 3 goddamn degrees. There isn't a bookmark thing in the book itself, but they did include one with the purchase, and it's nice enough, I suppose, but I would have preferred something a little bit more colourful, but what are you going to do? It's a fucking bookmark. So, let's get on to talking about the book itself, and before we do that, I'm going to flip it over to the back so you can read what the brief on the back says. The fame of Monkey Island may be entirely due to software piracy. Putting a quote that big, it makes you think that the entirety of the book is going to be based around that statement, but it's not. It feels like a more generic take on the entire thing from beginning to end. I figured that would be like one of the first lines of the book or something. It's not. It's actually page 304 of page 320. So, it's just weird. Like, I've never seen a book do that before. Have its back quote be so close to the end that it feels like it ends up being entirely irrelevant to what the book is trying to set up with this back of the book brief. With that said, though, there is another thing too that I would like to warn you about well in advance. So let's just lift that up and let you have a better view of that. These two are okay. This, which is just a list of the people they either interviewed or just had mentioned as part of the book, also okay. The bottom one, let me read this out for you. Crackers the Gold Rush takes the reader a crucial step deeper into a highly organised illegal European network that acted like a corporation ahead of its time. Key industry figures such as Rob Northen make their point. Former code breakers on Apple II, BBC Micro, Sinclair Spectrum, Amstrad CPC, C64, Amiga, and especially Atari ST reveal the truth of a unique computer youth. When they say especially Atari ST, they aren't fucking kidding. Like, half this goddamn book is about people who are on the Atari ST, at least. Now, I did read this a bit broken up, because, like, in between getting this book, I discovered that I needed new glasses, because I was having trouble reading with my old ones. So it actually took me a while to really dig into this book, and I was, like, doing it piecemeal, so I do, like, 20 pages and then another 20 pages and all that, so admittedly, my memories about how this book is really structured might be a tiny bit off, just because it took me a few weeks to read through this thing, but yeah, like seriously, half the fucking book is Atari ST, and I am honestly not really a fan of this, because there are so many ways you can dig into this, because Jason Scott made an absolutely fantastic video called, I can't remember the exact name of it, but it's about pirates in the Apple II scene, and how they would fight back and forth entirely through, like, messages that would pop up before cracked games load up, and that was an absolutely fascinating bit of history, and I feel like that focusing so much on something like the Atari ST is a bit of a shit, and at the same time, this book barely goes over that subject. I feel like there's only like a couple of pages maximum about that sort of thing, and as a result, I end up being disappointed, because I don't feel like this book goes deep enough. Whether it be in particular certain areas, or just into, like, stories about what happens to people, but we need to open up the book for me to really start explaining that. So let's open it up to the contents page, shall we? At the very least. Here's the contents page. So the way the book is laid out is you've got a bunch of sections over here that are somewhat relevant to what they're about, but we'll get into that. And then you've just got, like, standalone little things here over on the right that give you a bunch of different things going on about minor parts of that particular part of the thing, of the industry of that time in general, and honestly a lot of it just feels irrelevant. And by a lot of it, I mean the way that they've organized the book, because the way they've organized this book is a bit weird. So, nucleus of the computer industry is absolutely fine. It is entirely relevant to what they're talking about there. Then 1984 was not like 1984, and onwards just feel entirely irrelevant headings. It feels like a gigantic blob of text back here with no real relevance as to what those headings are actually talking about. Like, for example, the Mastertronic strategy. You'll get like 4 pages on why that worked in terms of them releasing really cheap tape-based games in order to try and combat piracy. And then it just kind of goes back into this miasma of randomly going back and forth between certain hackers, crackers, and time periods. So, I don't know if this is me, but this is just what I felt like reading the book. The way that they've outlined this means that you do start at the very beginning, and you do move on to, like, 1984, but once you start talking about, like, individual crackers, individual projects, and all that, I don't know if it's laid out chronologically, but the way that they've written it makes it feel like they really jump around a bit in terms of just going back and forth in time between place to place, person to person, event to event. And as a result, again, this all just kind of feels irrelevant. It feels like just one big blob of text that nobody really took the time to pace out properly. Again, I read this over weeks, so this might not be true. This might just be me misremembering or misreading certain parts of the text, but that's just what it felt like to me having gone through it the first time. So yeah, it just feels weirdly going back and forth between time periods and such, and so these headings feel irrelevant. And then they just kind of dropped all of these in at random times, and some of them I just don't understand the placement of it all. Again, I don't really know enough about the industry to determine whether or not it was actually relevant to put that there, but it just feels weird. And these are all just like 2-page spreads or what have you that talk about certain events, certain people, certain things in the industry. And yeah, again, it just feels kind of random. I don't know if this is just me, but it just feels really off the way that they've ordered things in the book. So let's just turn some pages and give you a look, because I don't really have a problem with the way that they've presented it here. Not a problem at all in terms of the way they've got the text going on, the way that they've got the pictures, how it's all laid out. Very little of it causes issues in the way of like actually reading the book, knowing what's relevant to what and where you'll be reading next. I don't have a problem with any of that whatsoever. I apologize if you can't see that too well. I'll try and edit this video to give you a slightly closer look at it. And there's nothing wrong with the actual page turning, as I said. The pages themselves are really nice. They're not even that glossy. Like even under, like almost directly under a light, it's got basically no gloss to it. It remains easy to see. It remains easy to read. The font is nice to read. There's nothing wrong with any of that. But let me tell you about the really big problem that I had with reading this personally. And I admit it, I'm a bit of a grammar Nazi. I find myself really tripping over like weirdly written sentences and really strangely done translations. Oh look, sex games. That's probably going to get me banned from YouTube. I admit that I tend to have a problem with weirdly written, weirdly translated, just odd things. And I'll notice like almost immediately if something feels like it wasn't written by someone who knows English as their first language. And I don't have a problem with reading books that come from other languages. I mean, I've got the bloody visual compendiums, right? And they're all written by a French guy. But when I read this book, it feels entirely different to that because it's got some real problems with the way the text is written, man. Just the way the sentences flow, the word choices, and even certain like really obvious things that you'd think would be spotted by someone reading through who was a natural English speaker just don't get pointed out here. Like, for example, one of the biggest things I know, one of the biggest sentences in this book that got pointed out was the fact that they were explaining a reference to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Fair enough. You kind of need to do that. It's not exactly the most relevant media franchise these days. Someone who's picking up this book to read through that may well not know about the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. But they misquote it. Instead of saying life, the universe, and everything, they say life, the universe, and the rest. So it reads like someone's taken the German version of that quote, or the French version of that quote, and translated that to English, instead of using the actual English quote, and it's not come out right as a result. And there's a few examples of that throughout this book, where it's like, they clearly meant to use this word, or this phrasing, but they've used something that's been, like, almost translated word for word, and it comes off as really stiff, awkward, or something along those lines, and it's constantly permeated throughout this book, both minor and major examples of that, and as a result, again, for someone like me, who's a bit of a grammar Nazi, it just makes the book kind of painful to read, because I'm always picking them up on these errors and thinking, oh man, you could have done this so much better. And again, it has been done better. I've got the visual compendiums, and there's a couple of examples like that, but I've never noticed anything quite that awkward in the compendiums versus life, the universe, and the rest in this book. And it just gets odd. And as a result, I find myself just, when I'm reading through that's the PayPal logo. I find myself reading through this book and just being constantly tripped up by their odd choices of translations. I've actually seen that, well, not this ad in particular, but I've seen these fast ads before because I saw the Ashens thing on computer, what was it, anti-piracy, things along those lines, and the way they tried to handle that. And then you've just got these advertisements that are entirely in German or in French, and they don't take the time to translate them for you. And I mean, like, for something like this, I understand. Like, this is a huge amount of fucking text, and it's tiny, so I can understand why they don't do that. But then you'll get, like, a big, like, advertisement that's, like, just a few words, nothing particularly out of the ordinary, and they won't even bother to translate that. And it just gets frustrating after a while. And again, they do start focusing on the Ataris really quick, and they just never go off it. And as a result, you find yourself reading about a lot of Atari hackers and a lot of people along those lines. And I gotta tell you, a lot of the stories just aren't that interesting. Oh yeah, like look, there's like the one time they bother to actually translate it. At least they chose a relatively interesting advertisement to do. But it doesn't happen that often. So, you end up reading about a lot of these hackers and how they got started. And a lot of them have the same origin story, which is, I saw this computer, I liked it, I started hacking stuff. But then, when they start talking about how they hack stuff, like how they go into the assembly code of a game and slowly read through it and look through it and are like, oh, this is how this works and this is how this works. You'll get like 1 or 2 lines about that. And they'll never talk about the really easy stuff. Sometimes you'll get something along the lines of, you'll get a decent explanation of how the game got cracked. Like there's a couple of pages they dedicate to the cracking of, damn it, I know the name of the game. It's the really popular dungeon crawling game. It's like it's not Dungeon Siege, it's something else. God, I can't remember it. But in the middle of the book, you'll get a description of how they cracked one of the really popular, but also really hard to figure out games. But that's like the best explanation you get for how things actually get cracked. And it's a bit disappointing, because I would have loved to get a bit more technical and a bit more in-depth with that, especially on a subject like 80s computer cracking, where actual technical readouts of that sort of thing are either like really hard to find or so hunkered down in technobabble that they become unintelligible to the average user, and I am absolutely the average user. So I would have loved to have heard more about how certain games got cracked and how certain things along those lines happen, or how certain things work behind the scenes. But they seem determined to make things as brief as possible and then get back to like the hacker stories, and a lot of them just aren't that interesting. You'll spend a lot of time reading about how certain hackers felt about certain things, and how there'll be certain things like a TV program that went on that they were talking back and forth about the benefits and downsides to computer piracy, and it will be written really awkwardly, and you won't really feel like you're getting the flow of the conversation as a result of that. Or you'll read about how certain games are getting cracked, or how certain games are really boring as a result, and you just don't get an explanation as to why. And you feel like you're being left behind on this journey. You feel like there's a bunch of information going on behind the scenes that you just don't know about because they haven't bothered to put it in the book. As a result, it ends up feeling like a bit more as a by hackers from the 80s computer age, for hackers from the 80s computer age, and I can't imagine there's many hackers from the 80s computer age left. I don't know if it's just me. I don't know if it's just me being stupid and not understanding half the stuff that's being put out in the book, but that's just how it feels to me. And even halfway through that, it gets a bit worse, because the way that they outlay things in the book and just explanations of certain things, whether it be explanations of how games get cracked, or how the industry works, or how they would interact with each other, gets spread really far out. And as a result, you feel like you're kind of getting jumped around between certain parts of the industry, and you're not feeling like you're being able to really draw the web together of how all these things work in your head. And as a result, you just start feeling a little bit confused. Yeah, there it is. That's the game I'm talking about. What's this fucking... Dungeon Master. Thank you, book, for actually putting things on the right page there. And as a result, it's just... It just reads really awkwardly. The combination of the way that they've laid the book out, making it feel like just a giant blob more than separate sections, the way that they've ordered particular things, explanations, ways that they go about things, just makes it feel like a really awkward read, because you're going back and forth between things, not really being able to draw a web out between them. Combine these two things with the fact that the translation is not the best. It's kind of awkward. It makes it really hard to read, and it makes some of the conversations and interviews feel really stiff. It makes the book feel not great, just as a general reading experience, when you actually get down to the nitty-gritty of actually reading the text. And yeah, as a result, I just don't like it. I feel like I've missed out on a bunch of information this book could have told me. I feel like that I wasn't really able to draw a web in my head of all these things going on. And like they are there, and there are some interesting stories about how like hacker parties would happen, how people would meet up and start these particular scenes. The internet comes along with the introduction of dial-up modems and BBSs, so they do give in a little bit of information about that, but it's basically nothing. Like, they don't give you anything about like the pirate BBS networks at the time and how they would work, how they'd have things like private sections going on in the background. You do get a little bit about it, but I feel like it could have gone into way more detail. And that's how I feel about a lot of this book and the way it explains things like cracking stuff and how the games and how they would work. Like, there's a bunch of places in this book where they start listing out a bunch of really notable titles, but then don't get into why those titles were notable in the first place. And it just seems awkward. Like, I know it's a book about crackers, but when you're bringing up a bunch of titles and saying these were all great titles for the time, one or two of these were absolutely revolutionary, and then you take no time to explain what they actually do, it makes the entire book feel really awkward. And yeah, as a result, at the end of it, I felt entirely unfulfilled. And even towards the end, it felt like they were starting to rush things a bit. You spend so much time talking about all of these particular hacking things, and then it just goes like into absolute overdrive towards the end by slipping in a bunch of stuff about how certain anti-piracy things started working, and then it just kind of stops. I don't know if it's just me, but yeah, at the end of this, I just felt really unsatisfied. It was kind of neat reading about the history of these cracking groups and all of that, but the rest of the book just feels like, again, it feels like a book made by 80s hackers for 80s hackers. And I guess I'm either not part of this, or the book didn't do a very good job trying to draw me into this world. And so as a result, Crackers, the Gold Rush, just wasn't that interesting to me. If you do actually have this book for like the one subscriber I have who actually has a copy of Crackers, the Gold Rush, and you think I'm wrong about this and why, please leave a comment. I'd love to know what I've gotten so wrong about this book, because it sounded amazing, but yeah, I don't know if I've been hung out to dry or if I've just done this to myself. With that being said, this has been Blue Maxima. I'll see you all next time.